Nú ætlum við að hefja næsta þema hjá okkur og það hvernig við getum notað drifkraft fjármagns til þess að hafa áhrif á virðiskeðjurnar okkar. Og nú drögum við svolítið saman það sem við erum búin að vera að leggja grunninn að í fyrri erindum, af því að það skilja allir að flæði fjármagns í heiminum hefur gífurlega mótandi áhrif á það hvernig hlutir eru gerðir, hvar við leggjum áherslurnar. Og það sem við fjárfestum í, það vex og dafnar, þannig að það eins gott að vanda sig í þessum málum. Við ætlum að fá að heyra frá honum Kamil Zabielski og ég skipti aftur yfir á ensku því hann verður hérna með okkur á skjánum. Kamil is a human rights lawyer who works as head of sustainable finance at Storebrand asset management in Norway. Kamil has previously worked as, for example, the head of sustainability in the Norwegian Export Credit Guarantee Agency, long name, and as a consultant of the ethics committee of the Norwegian government pension fund, also known as the oil fund. So I know that Kamil has super interesting cases because Storebrand is really putting the emphasis on trying to have a positive effect. So the word is yours, Kamil.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So thank you for the invitation to speak and greetings from our studio in Oslo. I have the task to give you a high-level perspective, an investor perspective of how we address human rights issues in our value chain, our investments, particularly on two issues, companies in conflict areas and dilemmas within the green transition. And I'll try my best to do that in 10 minutes. Why am I speaking about this? As you said in the introduction, I am a human rights lawyer by background, and I've worked in the finance sector for 20 years, which can be a bit of a paradox, those two things. But in any case, worked as a human rights lawyer for the Norwegian government oil fund, the sovereign wealth fund, and 10 years with the project finance all over the world, including in Iceland, actually. And now managing sustainability risks for Storebrand Asset Management. And we are investing in roughly 4,500 companies. Just to be clear that investors are not a generic group. So the kind of influence that you can have over a company will vary if you're a sovereign wealth fund or if you're a bank lending money or if you're a minority shareholder like we are. When I worked with project financing, the bank had set very clear conditions for our loans. I spent time in the Middle East ensuring that the projects that we finance do not have workers that are being subcontracted under forced labor conditions, and we can set certain conditions to ensure that. Or in Latin America, when we're financing, for example, hydroelectric dam projects, that people and communities that are moved because of the dam are compensated and resettled in an appropriate manner. As an asset manager, with sometimes less than 1% ownership in a company, we don't necessarily have that kind of leverage over a company. But we still have the responsibility to conduct due diligence and to mitigate human rights risks. And there is a basic formula for this which we are following. First of all, you need to have a human rights policy. That policy needs to outline very clearly what are the human rights principles that your investment decisions are based on. Secondly, you need to have a system in order to identify and assess those human rights risks. And finally, and I would say most importantly, you need to manage those risks. You need to prioritize how you manage those risks. And there are three basic ways of doing this. The first is engagement. So to raise your concerns to the management of the company, that they potentially may be involved in contributing to human rights violations. If they are unwilling to address this, then you can escalate that dialogue. And there's many ways of doing that. One way is raising a shareholder resolution. Another way is collaborating with other investors, global investors, to put pressure on the company. Or, as we do, you can put the company on a public observation list, freezing trading in the company and setting certain expectations to them. If these measures don't work, as a last resort, one can always exclude a company, and we also do that. Unfortunately, there are an increase of conflicts in the world. It is challenging enough for us as investors to get information on human rights risks related to companies in peacetime. This challenge is even greater in conflict areas. And this is because there's a breakdown of the state, there's suppression of media and civil society, and not least, companies are much less willing to speak to us about their operations in conflict areas. One of the conflicts that has received a lot of attention recently, but has been going on for decades, is the conflict in the occupied Palestinian territories, which is quite a sensitive topic. Our position on the occupation, similar to that of the occupation in West Sahara, is very clear. We base our decisions on international law, and international humanitarian law is quite clear on this matter. The occupation is intended to be temporary in nature. Activities that enforce the permanent occupation, such as the construction of illegal settlements, is a breach of international humanitarian law. I also want to make it clear that we do not boycott Israel or Israeli companies. Our approach is based on international humanitarian law, meaning companies that are contributing to serious breaches of international humanitarian law, or that are in some other way enforcing the permanent occupation, are considered for exclusion. There are nuances to this, and there's various degrees of contribution to international humanitarian law breaches. We concentrate on companies that are involved in the most severe contribution, and that is companies that are involved in surveillance or technology or ID equipment that enables the enforcement of the occupation, companies that are contributing to the construction of illegal settlements. But there's also a third category, and that is companies that are buying civilian goods and services, which we do not focus so much on. And that is because there is a difference between an avocado exporter and a construction company that is building illegal settlements. One example of an exclusion that we made is IBM. The company operates surveillance database, an ID system that normalizes the situation of Israeli citizens in illegal settlements. This we constitute as being an enforcement of the permanent occupation. We have excluded companies previously for similar services, but afterwards, through dialogue with the company and them terminating their contracts and operations there, we have re-included them. So it's also important to note that an exclusion is not a death sentence. If companies cease the operations on which they've been excluded on, they can be re-included into our investment portfolio. Another challenge that we face is mobilizing capital towards the green transition. And so the question is, does the urgency to address the climate crisis, which I think we all agree is real, allow us to trump basic human rights? And can we as investors turn a blind eye to, for example, indigenous people's rights or forced labor in the supply chain in order to construct renewable energy projects? We would argue that you don't have to. There is such thing called the just transition. And let me give you two examples of that. We had a case of a company that was building an onshore wind park in northern Norway. The area was roughly 40 square kilometers, and it was also an area that was used by the Sami, the indigenous people of Norway, for reindeer herding. The park had over 70 turbines and also had over 60 kilometers of access roads, which made it difficult for the Sami to herd their reindeer. As you can see here in a picture that I took on site, that some of the access roads have these ice walls that are 2 to 3 meters high, making it very difficult to herd the reindeer, and sometimes requiring the Sami to use very untraditional ways, such as helicopters, and thereby also losing some of their herd. The company did not have the free prior informed consent of the Sami to construct this park, and therefore did not have the social license to operate. It has been ruled in the Supreme Court of Norway, and similar projects around like this have been stopped because of that reason, which is also for us as an investor a financial and legal risk. So we engaged with the company and we set them on a public observation list. We froze our trading in the company and we said we have two expectations to you. One is that you have to re-enter consultation with the Sami reindeer herders and come to an agreement. And second, you have to put in place measures in order to avoid these kind of situations in the future so that you have a social license to operate. Similar challenges in the solar sector value chain. As many of you are familiar with, solar panels are essentially made of polysilicon. The raw material polysilicon, 75% of the world's polysilicon comes from China. And a large part of that comes from one province, the Xinjiang province, where it's well known that there is widespread discrimination and forced labor of the Uyghur minority. And there are many levels within this supply chain, as you are probably quite familiar with. You have everything from the mining of the raw material to the production of the solar panels to the companies that are actually constructing and operating the solar parks. Our approach has been to map our portfolio of 4,500 companies and see where do these companies fall within this supply chain, and then to prioritize those companies that are potentially closest to the human rights violations, i.e., those that are actually mining the polysilicon and may have operations in Xinjiang, and to engage with them. Now, in this case, it was not possible to engage with them, so our only option was to sell out of those investments, not to have them. On the other end of the supply chain, you have the more, I would say, the Western companies that are constructing and operating the solar parks. With them, we could have more of a meaningful engagement. And in these cases, we were able to convey to them the need to establish certain measures to have responsible supply chain sourcing practices, not to source polysilicon from Xinjiang. So there's a range of measures that can be taken depending on the company and where they are in the supply chain. See, I'm out of time right now, but I'd just like to leave you with one thing that if you were to remember from today is that all investors have a responsibility to conduct due diligence and to use the influence they have to mitigate human rights risks in their value chain, i.e. our investments. If they aren't able to use that influence and there continues to be a risk of serious human rights violations, they need to seriously consider whether or not that is an investment they want to maintain. And the answer sometimes may be no. Thank you.